Excellent. Well, thank you guys for coming out on at the end of what's been a certainly a wild week, even by 2020 standards. So I appreciate you taking the time and interest. Hopefully we can have a little fun and talk about drinking and do some drinking. I know Dan had sent out some suggested wines to go out and get. If you have them, feel free to pop them and drink them whenever you want. I do have a specific spot in the talk where I'll speak to them a little bit, but I'm not going to be offended if you start drinking now. All right. So to start out, just a little bit about me. Dan introduced me. Thank you for that. I am a food and wine writer. That's kind of how I come to this. About 15 or so years ago, I started a website called Mainline Dine. It was a restaurant and dining blog. This was before blogs really existed, or I mean, they existed, but it wasn't really a household word. I didn't actually have that much intention to become a food and wine writer, but I was just sick and tired of seeing new restaurants open up in my area, which is the mainline area, and not finding any information about it online. So I started just posting it online, and apparently I wasn't the only one who felt that way, because very quickly developed a bit of a following without doing a whole lot. And long story short, that opened up a lot of other opportunities for me to write about food and eventually wine. As I started a family and stopped going out to restaurants as much, I started to focus on other things, and wine became one of them. And I became really obsessed with wine. And so it took a lot of interest there. A few years ago, I was, so I guess to take a step back, I actually didn't grow up in this area. I grew up in the Boston area, New England. So I have been to a cranberry bog, and it is indeed pretty cool. So I recommend that. I forget when we said that program was, but so always interested in the food and the stories behind the food as a writer. So I picked up Will Weaver's book, As American as Shoe Fly Pie, which I'm sure you guys are familiar with, or certainly with Will's work. And so I was flipping through the book and I saw this photo.
Mike, to say, Will was our first president of our organization.
Yeah, I knew he was involved in the organization for sure. I didn't see him on the list today, but I know he's still around. So I was reading through the book and I saw this photo, and the caption of the photo said, Pennsylvania Dutchmen enjoying Mount Penn wines at their Stammtisch, which is a German word for regulars table, in Reading, PA wine saloon, 1868. And I thought, whoa, like Mount Penn wines, Reading, PA wine saloon. This is 45 minutes from my house. I'm sort of obsessed with the wine culture of Europe. I have Italian heritage, as you can guess from my name, German heritage. I've been lucky enough to spend a lot of time traveling around to wine regions in Europe and really seeing how important wine is to just life. And that's something that always really interested me. So when I saw this picture, I was like, wow, this really jumped out at me. I'd never heard of this before, and it really drew me in. On the opposite page, it spoke of the famous meal served at Kooklers Roost, one of the best known of the Pennsylvania Dutch haute cuisine eateries of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And I just thought, whoa. It went on to say, this is the first of several PA Dutch style Weinstube, wine bars, where fine cooking and locally made wines went hand in hand with a style of cuisine that was European in tone, yet thoroughly Pennsylvania Dutch in character. And so I had one of these moments where I was sitting in my office. It was the middle of the day. I was looking at this information, 3 hours go by, it's dark out, I just have the glare on my screen. I'm yelling to my wife, like, hey, you're not going to believe what happened in 1897. And, I know she's rolling her eyes at me, even though she's not in the room. So long story short, I ended up doing a bunch of research on it for a number of reasons. I wrote this book, Lost Mount Penn, which does focus quite a bit on the Reading, PA area, and sort of how the German immigrants built a wine region there. But also part of it was to dig a little further into the history of wine in Pennsylvania in general, because one obviously led to the other. And today we're going to focus a little more on just broader Pennsylvania, although I'll talk a little bit more about some of the Reading stuff as we dig into it a little further. I was going to say too, there's I've got the chat up here, so if anyone has any questions, feel free to pop a chat. Otherwise, I'll have some time for questions as we go through. So to go back to like, not the very beginning, but the very beginning in terms of at least European colonialism of the United States is concerned. When the Vikings first came to North America, they nicknamed it Vinland because there were wild grapes growing everywhere. In fact, Dan sent me this thing he found a week or two ago. It was written in 1860. It was a Philadelphia historical book, and there was a passage that said that jumped out to me. It said, "The numerous grapevines everywhere climbing the branches of our forest trees," this is describing this area, of course, "gave some sanction to the idea that ours may have been the ancient Vinland so mysteriously spoken of by the Norwegian writers." So I thought that was pretty interesting. Many accounts, late 1600s, early 1700s, of Europeans coming here spoke of wild grapevines kind of growing everywhere. That said, when the Europeans came over, they found these wild grapevines, and of course they tried to make wine. Thomas Jefferson in particular is known for his attempts to jumpstart a wine industry in the United States. I think he's still the president who spent the most money on wine as president. So wine was a big deal to him. But when they started to try to make wine from these native and local grapes, the quality was not to their liking. There was just a different flavor to these grapes, which we'll talk about more as we go on. But what we say today is that it's described as usually foxy. There's this like feral, funky, not all that pleasant odor that comes particularly from the skins of the wild grapes in North America that made both table grapes and wine not really up to the standards from the European standpoint. So there were many attempts then to bring over grapes from the old country and start a wine industry here. They figured if grapes are growing here, why wouldn't the grapes that we like work well over here? So in 1682, William Penn, before coming over here to negotiate the purchase of Pennsylvania, sent for a bunch of grapevines from the Bordeaux area, and he brought those over with them. They were planted in an area that is now Fairmount Park along the Schuylkill River. I'm sure William Penn himself didn't plant them, but his gardeners and servants planted a large vineyard, about 200 acres of land. I found something described 1684 as a fine vineyard of French vines. However, like Jefferson, Penn's attempts struggled to work. Essentially, there's a number of agricultural factors. We've got climate and weather, of course, soil type, pests is probably the biggest one, pests and diseases. There were grapevine, pests and diseases that affected the grapes that were just new and different to these European varieties. And so in many cases, the vineyards failed and were unable to sort of consistently build wine. Penn himself was a little bit of a contradiction. He talked out of one side of his mouth about the quality that potentially these native vines could make. In 1683, he talked about a good claret that he had made from native grapes by a French immigrant. Claret being the English word for a Bordeaux style red, just a generic red wine, basically. And Penn kind of wondered whether the future here, especially as his French vines failed, wondered whether the future of winemaking here had to be with the native vines. He talked about, native grapes. He said, the great red grape is in itself an extraordinary grape, and by art doubtless may be cultivated to an excellent wine. But at the same time, he was advising people to send back to France for better quality wines. So it's a little unclear what he really believed, but certainly, you know, at this point they were trying to figure out whatever they could possibly make work here. You know, they were still obviously sending back to Europe for wines to drink, but they were sort of hell bent on making it work here in the Americas as well. As a quick aside, this just shows you 3 types of grapes. There are quite a few native grape species to the North America. The ones we're going to talk about today mostly. So on the left here, you have Vitis vinifera, which is the European species. Vitis being the now I'm blanking on the one before, the group or whatever. Vitis labrusca and Vitis riparia. So on the center is labrusca, and then to the right is riparia. You know, there's some subtle differences you can see. We're not going to go into that. I just thought I'd mention it, so we're sort of on the same thing here. There's lots of others. You may have heard of, say, muscadine or scuppernong or some well-known varieties that are in the southeastern United States. But here in this area in the Mid-Atlantic, labrusca and riparia are kind of the main 2 native grape species that we talk about. So fast forward to 1740, and something big happens in terms of the local wine industry. So this guy named James Alexander, who is a gardener for one of William Penn's sons, discovers a grapevine plant that looks different than anything he's ever seen before. He discovers it in the vicinity of this original vineyard, and you can see on the map here, Springlesbury is what the area was called, which I've had never heard of before this, so I don't know if we still call it that or not. But again, sort of near Fairmount Park, just outside the city, Alexander discovers this grape that seems to have characteristics of both the local Vitis labrusca and the European Vitis vinifera. In particular, it had a self-pollinating flower, which is a vinifera quality, but it seemed to be growing widely. And they experimented with it to determine that it had kind of this disease and pest resistance of a local. And so they discovered that it is believed to be the first kind of spontaneous hybrid, a hybrid being a crossing of 2 different species of grape, so hybrid grape. And as they started to experiment with it, they realized that it made decent quality wine, palatable wine, and was also able to be grown in a pretty good way. There's a book called The Grapes of New York, which was published in 1908 by a guy named U.P. Hedrick. It's an important book for anyone who's interested in East Coast wine history, which I realize is probably not a huge amount of people, but it's very interesting to me. But he wrote, the Alexander was a coarse grape with so much foxiness, there's that word again, of flavor, that it did not please the other growers who had been accustomed to European sorts as a table grape, but it made a very good wine of the claret type and was grown for the purpose until displaced by other grapes. It was a wine made from this variety that Thomas Jefferson pronounced worthy of the best vineyards of France. Probably a little bit of an exaggeration there, but he really wanted it to work, right?
Mike, what do you think foxy meant? What is that?
It's this aroma that comes from the grape skins that smells like a dirty fox. Probably is probably the best way to describe it. It's a very unique aroma. that is a little bit hard. But again, I like to say it's a little bit feral, it's a little bit funky. It's interesting with wine. I mean, as a wine geek myself, we sometimes talk about terms that don't sound good as a good thing. So I might say, oh, this wine has a really tarry smell. And I might be saying that in a good way, but rarely is the foxy term used as a positive in this particular case.
And I just interject here. That was the arrow is sort of near the Spring Mill Cafe, and that's why we were going to have our annual meeting there, is because it was close to where these grapes were being cultivated.
That is correct. And there's another connection to that, which I'll get to in a minute. And Marianne just posted in the chat that Springett Penn was actually William Penn's son's name, and so that's why Springett's Berry was his land. So that's interesting. I didn't realize that. So the Alexander then, again, because it was really the first grape that anybody had found to be able to work and produce wine in, in a meaningful way in the Northeast U.S., it started to become propagated around the area. John Bartram, I'm sure you all know, was a famous gardener in Philly. He was an important person in terms of propagating this around the area, growing it in his Bartram's garden, and then his son after him. A Pennsylvania Quaker named Thomas Livesey operated a mill on the Wissahickon near Philadelphia. In June 1767, he sent some wines made from the Alexander grape to Ben Franklin in London. And London affirmed that the wine had been found excellent by many good judges. Franklin was in France. He was also a diplomat. So whether that's really true or not, I'll leave up to you guys, but certainly an interesting fact. 1768, the American Philosophical Society in Philadelphia showed off a number of local Alexander wines that were made. Also in 1768, a guy named John Leacock planted an Alexander vineyard in Lower Merion Township, which I thought was interesting. And around this time, the wine industry, if you would, mostly private farmers, but starts to grow not only in the Philadelphia area, but Chester County, Lancaster County, York County. In fact, going back to Hedrick, the guy who wrote the book Grapes of New York, he wrote, in looking up the history of the varieties of the grapes for this work, a surprisingly large number have been traced back to this early center of the industry. So many that York and Lancaster counties in Pennsylvania must be counted amongst the starting places of American viticulture. I should also say that, when we start to go to different places, although we're still talking about this Alexander grape, it had a bunch of different names. It was known as the Schuylkill, it was known as the Clifton Constantia, Tasker's grape, the York Madeira. There was a variety of different names. It wasn't, it wasn't as controlled of an industry as it is today. So you probably had it propagating around and different people giving it different names. But people believe that it was all really the same grape, or potentially clones of the same grape. So then 1786, a Frenchman named Pierre Peter Legault, founded the first commercial vineyard in the United States. He called it the Pennsylvania Vine Company. Okay, up here on the screen, you see the plan for this. It was in sort of White Marsh County, Conshohocken area. Again, near the Spring Mill Cafe, actually very close. And I'll just jump ahead one slide real quick. So this is actually Legault's estate on the original land that still exists. It's in White Marsh, PA. You can go there today. That's obviously a modern photo. So Legault started this business, brought over a bunch of vines from famous regions in France like Burgundy and Champagne and Bordeaux. He even convinced the Pennsylvania state legislature to make this a public company that people could buy shares in, which is what you see on the right here, is an actual share certificate from the Pennsylvania Vine Company. first in 1793, then again in 1800. He still was trying to get the business kind of off the ground and up and running. In 1800, the $20 share price could be, or what was brought down to just $1 per share. Not actually, you still, I think, owed the $20, but you could pay $1 at the start to buy a share. Unfortunately, because Legault had put most of his faith in these French vines, the company was never truly successful. In 1803 alone, he lost 14,000 vines to late spring frosts. There were lots of other reasons, as we talked about, why these European vines were just unable to really sustain and last in the current conditions. And so, as the grapes failed, the stockholders were unhappy, and the vineyards were eventually neglected, and the company failed. Legault, though, is a really fascinating guy. It's by all counts, he was quite a scoundrel. There was a duke from France who traveled through the area during this time and took an instant dislike to Legault. And in his writings, he commented that since he had been in America, Legault had put forth over 200 lawsuits, all of them unsuccessful. I found another account in a Montgomery County journal that talked about a guy who built a house for a man as payment for him beating up Legault because he just didn't like him so much, and said that if he killed him, he would take the blame for it. So the guy was definitely a character, if anything else, if not a charlatan. But that all comes together in terms of wine, actually. So the thing he probably did most for the industry was his propagation of a grape that was called Cape. And he said that it was a Vitis vinifera grape, so European grape that had come from the Cape of Good Hope in South Africa, which you'll notice is not actually part of Europe, but and so he was convinced that, or he convinced people, I guess I should say, that he had this Cape grape and that this grape worked really well here in the United States. Turns out it was actually the Alexander grape that we've just been talking about. Because, as I said, it had a self-pollinating flower, which these European grapes have, he was able to pass it off even to experts as something that came from Europe or South Africa. Again, difficult to follow that particular line. But what's interesting is that a lot of people, historians, kind of believe that if he had told people that this was this native grape or a hybrid, they probably wouldn't have wanted it. But because he told people that it was a European grape, people took it, started making wine with it. It made decent enough wine, and it really propagated the Alexander grape throughout the mid-Atlantic, even into the Midwest a bit, and really start to build up a possibility of a wine industry in this place. So even though he was somewhat nefarious in his dealings, he in the end did something good for the industry overall. So around 1823, after the Alexander, you started to see additional hybrid grapes start to come into play that eclipse the Alexander in terms of quality. So around 1823, a grape called Catawba was introduced by a guy named John Adlam, who lived in the District of Columbia, but was actually born and raised in York, Pennsylvania, which, as we talked about earlier, was an early center for the Alexander. So certainly believe that he brought some of his knowledge from growing up in PA. Comparing to the Alexander, Hedrick wrote, the Catawba being superior in quality, more resistant to rot and mildew, and ripening slightly earlier. and really one of the most interesting and successful of the early grapes. Hedrick also called it the first great American grape. There was a guy named Nicholas Longworth in Cincinnati, Ohio, the wine mecca that is Cincinnati, Ohio. And you can see here on the right, I've got a drawing of one of his vineyards on the Cincinnati River, or the Ohio River, perhaps. He started growing Catawba, and long story short, accidentally created a sparkling Catawba by having the wine re-ferment in the bottle. And he created this sparkling rosé Catawba wine. Catawba is a red grape. You can see it there on the screen, but often made into a rosé wine. Those of you who bought the rosé for today, that's made from Catawba. And this became like the first very popular American wine. And Nicholas Longworth really became the first successful winemaker in the United States. This is kind of in the early to mid 1800s. A London writer once wrote of his sparkling Catawba that it transcends the champagnes of France, if you can believe that. Also, Longfellow, the famous poet, wrote a poem about Catawba. I'll just read you guys a little blurb from it. It's very good in its way is the Verzenay. He's referencing Champagne subregions, or the Sillery, soft and creamy, but Catawba wine has a taste more divine, more dulcet, delicious, and dreamy. There grows no vine by the haunted Rhine, by the Danube or the Guado quiver, as again are famous rivers in Europe, nor island or cape that bears such a grape as grows by the beautiful river. That's Longfellow's ode to the Catawba. Over time, some additional grapes came into play in Pennsylvania and in the Northeast. On the left, you have Isabella. There's not a whole lot of consensus on where these grapes came from. Catawba, there's a Catawba River down in the Carolinas, and there's some belief that maybe it came from there, but nobody really knows for sure. Same thing with Isabella. One interesting fact about Isabella is that it's believed that Isabella is probably the grape that brought phylloxera to Europe. So phylloxera is a little tiny louse that sucks the sap out of grapevines. And the native American grapes were immune to it. They could have phylloxera infestation basically and would continue to grow. Whereas when it was brought to Europe, it decimated Europe, like France. They thought the industry might be completely wiped out in the late 1800s, early 1900s, France, Spain, Italy. It made its way across the continent until they found out that they could graft the European vines onto the rootstock of American vines. But it's believed that Isabella is probably the grape that brought phylloxera over. So I always found that kind of an infamous thing. On the far right, we have Clinton. An interesting thing about Clinton is that it's a hybrid of Labrusca and Riparia, so it is fully native, but there was a time where it was pretty popular. It's actually, believe it or not, still grown in Europe, not so much in the United States. I think it made its way over there during this phylloxera epidemic. And then in the center, we have Concord, of course, which was one that came, a little bit later, but certainly the Welch family of Erie, who made wine as well as grape juice, really brought the Concord into prominence. Concord probably more used as a table grape and for grape juice, but also you can still find some Concord wine around if you're so inclined. So although the English and French were certainly the first to come out and plant the, and I'll just comment, Becky posted in the chat, I'd love to be able to taste a pre-phylloxera French wine. I've read they tasted different for the last so cold. Yeah, that would be really interesting. There are certainly some places in the world where you can taste pre-phylloxera wines or native rootstock wines. Typically sandy soils or some volcanic soils, the phylloxera can't survive, and so you still can have them, but unfortunately not, we're not talking about Bordeaux or Burgundy. We're talking about Mount Etna in Sicily, which makes really interesting wines, by the way, but obviously not as historic as those places. Oh, whoops. Hey-oh. Lost my place here. Apologies for that. So anyway, what I was saying is that although the English and French I've been talking about mostly, the Germans were perhaps more persistent and more influential in Pennsylvania over time as a really large German immigrant population started to grow in this area. A guy named Francis Pastorius, who was the leader of the German settlers at Germantown, the creatively named Germantown. In 1691, they chose their town seal. And you can see on there, it's pretty rough drawing, but it was actually a grapevine, a flax blossom, and a weaver's spool to show that those were the things that the people lived from in that space. They did try, Pastorius himself actually brought vines with him when he came over, but they were spoiled by seawater in the Delaware Bay, unfortunately. There were some experiments made in Germantown. It never really grew out of that, but there are other places kind of in southeastern Pennsylvania where the Germans really did have some success. I talked about York, Pennsylvania, one of the early ones, a guy named Thomas Eichelberger in 1818 really was the pioneer in York in showing that this was a place where grapes could be grown successfully. Over on the right here is a book published in Reading in 1828 in German that talks about how to grow grapes for winemaking. So jumping into Reading specifically, again, the topic of my book, not the only place obviously that was growing wine successfully, but did develop into an interesting center of winemaking. So Berks County and Reading were established in the mid to late 1700s. A lot of Germans coming from southern Germany, the Rhineland-Palatinate area and southwest Germany. So even though Germany is often considered a beer country today, back then, well, even today, southern Germany is still a lot of great wine growing happening. In fact, I could probably argue that German wine right now is one of the most exciting areas to be in, probably related to climate change, but that's another conversation. But a bunch of Germans who arrived in the Reading area started no doubt planting vines and trying to make wine for their own consumption. In the 1820s was really when you started to see a reputation develop for what they called the Reading Red. And it was known by Germans kind of all around southeastern Pennsylvania as a place where decent wine was being made. A quote I found: "The Germans who came here were very fond of it and esteemed it highly as a table wine. It was relished by them all the more because it reminded them very much of their native country and its fine wines." Turns out the Reading Red was made by the Schuylkill grape, which is another name for the Alexander grape. So more evidence the Alexander really driving development of an industry here in Pennsylvania. But as the Catawba and Clinton and so forth and Isabella started to become more known, the local folks here started to move on to those wines as well. The other thing that's really interesting that the Germans brought, and I think is highlighted nicely in Reading specifically, is this idea that grapes grow well on slopes. And so the picture on the screen here is actually from the Mosel River in Germany. And you can see how steep the slope is. So Germany, especially at that time, was really the coolest area that you could grow successfully grow wine, but they grew it on these really steep slopes that were southern facing, so they got a ton of sun. And the other thing to understand about grape growing for fine wine is that the porous soils, the soils that nothing else can be grown on, often make some of the finest wines in the world. The grape vine really needs to struggle in order to succeed and develop complexity of flavor into a wine that, you know, we would judge as being really great. And so these Germans who came across saw that a lot of people were planting grapes in these fertile valleys. And as you know, Pennsylvania has a lot of fertile farmland in the center of the state. But Reading was particularly well set in that there, if you're not familiar with the area, the city itself is right on the Schuylkill River, but just outside the city are several mountains. I'm not talking enormous mountains, but several mountains: Mount Penn, Neversink Mountain, Mount Washington. And so these Germans who came to the area saw that people had kind of ignored these areas, just seeing them as this sort of barren wasteland. And they went up and they started planting grapes and having a lot of success there. The first plantings up on Mount Penn were in the 1830s, and then but the industry didn't really start to thrive until after the Civil War, once it kind of took hold and they figured out how to get everything going. Reading in particular is interesting. It became a very important city in the world. During the 1800s. It started out as it was a port along the Schuylkill. Anything that was going west from Philadelphia kind of came through Reading. And then, of course, the Reading Railroad Company was established and became one of the largest companies in the world during the 1800s. So the city was really thriving. But at the same time, what was really interesting is that the wine industry that had been growing at the same time allowed for really to become an entertainment hub, a leisure hub, a place known for its food and drink. And so these people who had originally started out by going up to the mountains and planting vineyards were able to turn these vineyards into wine houses and even resorts. Okay, so when we look at, again, I'm fast forwarding a bit here for time and space, but in the book, I go into a lot of detail about sort of how this transpired. But if we look at the late 1800s, you had several pleasure railroads open up in Reading. One on Mount Penn, the Mount Penn Gravity Railroad. Another on Neversink, which is a mountain just across the valley. And then, so sort of a quick aside on the train thing. You had the Mock Chunk Railway in Lehigh Valley, which was originally made for carrying cargo, but then became a pleasure ride. And some people say is the very first roller coaster that existed. And so in Reading, they kind of piggybacked on that idea of having this pleasure ride. A train went up and down the mountain. There was no reason you needed to ride it other than it was fun. And then resorts started to pop up so you could get off the train and go to a resort and have some food and drink and dance and all sorts of things like that. On the Mount Penn side, the train went up through steam, but then just used gravity to come back down. So again, you can imagine it picked up some serious speed. I'm sure they had brakes, but it was a fun ride. So Dan comments here, there's often a morning mist or fog that comes to these mountains around Reading. There's much like what happens in Napa or in France. Yeah, that's interesting. Always having that fog is something grapes definitely like as well. So you had all these resorts pop up on the mountain. I've just shown a couple old photos here of some of the resorts, and I'll give you a taste of kind of what they had. So in the upper left, you have Spoolers, which is one of the most popular places. From what I've said, and I found this in several places, they served an estimated 15,000 gallons of wine in a season, which is 75,000 bottles, which is, I still have a tough time believing it. Obviously, I'm not saying they made all this wine. This is wine that they bought from other places and sold, but that's, you can tell that there were some good times there if they served that much wine. Upwards of 2,000 people on an average weekend. They were known for their famous pig roast that lasted from noon to midnight. Over on the right, you had a place called Kaideich or Lauterbach Springs. They had this big grove on the bank of the reservoir there in Reading, and they used to hold these huge parties in the woods, mostly for German singing groups like the Harmony Manor Corps and things like that. On the bottom left, we have Centennial Springs Resort, which was on Neversink Mountain, as I mentioned, the mountain across the way. Had a 10-acre vineyard, and they stored it in a huge cellar that was built into the side of the mountain, which you can actually still see remnants of today. And then in the bottom right, you have Kooklers Roost. If you recall, I mentioned that earlier from William's book. The most legendary of all the places for sure, with its Swiss style inn, chicken and waffle suppers, and high quality local wine. So I wanted to talk a bit about Kooklers Roost, this guy, Jacob Kookler, because he was the guy who really pulled me into this story and made me want to learn more about it. Obviously, it's interesting to know that wine was being made, but the characters of the time really bring it to life and make it more interesting. Kookler was by far the most interesting character, even more so than Legault. He was known as Ludwig, Father Kookler, Herr Kookler, Mine Host, the big bearded Santa Claus of the Hills, and the Hermit of Mount Penn. Yes, he had a few nicknames. So he was this guy who came to the Reading area in like the 1850s from Germany, had a couple different jobs, ended up at some point running a saloon in town. It, for whatever reason, became the sort of happening spot for any important figures in Reading. This guy had a long, really long, you can see in the picture, a long beard, and he was said to have the heaviest mustache in the city. But he was bald, so he always wore this black velvet beret, and he had a long stemmed pipe, which was almost his constant companion. I like to think him, he's sort of this prototypical barkeep, and I feel like he would do well in Brooklyn today with his look, or maybe Northern Liberties in Philly or something like that. But anyway, Kookler, he bought some land up on Mount Penn. We're talking, Mount Penn is probably 3 or 4 miles outside the city. You can walk. It's a hike. I've done it. It's a challenging hike, but it is certainly doable. He started hanging out in the mountains with his friends. A few years go by. He buys even more land, and he decides he's going to move up and live up on the mountain. And this was before any of this development that I talked about a minute ago, hence his name, the Hermit of Mount Penn. He lived alone up on the mountain. He did have a family. His kids were grown by the time he left. I'm not really sure what happened to his wife. But he goes up on the mountain and builds a little shack to live in and builds a vineyard there as well. He was already known for selling some of the best local wine in his saloon in town. Now he's got his own vineyard and starts making his own wine. There's a comment from a Philadelphia journalist in the 1880s. I'll read to you. It says, perhaps no better sample of stubborn tenacity in the sphere of grape culture in eastern Pennsylvania can be cited than this place, talking about Kookler. Its owner speaks with pride how by an indomitable will, he nursed his little vineyard into life and proved to the world how Pennsylvania soil can produce the best wine made in this country. He has a modest little vault hidden in a rocky cellar from which he taps a wine that vies with the best brands of California. That cellar actually is still there. It was redone a little bit after his death, but if you hike up on Mount Penn, you can actually see it. I should have put a picture in here. I don't have it though, unfortunately. It's in the book though. Kookler is also known for his cooking, and I wanted to take a few minutes to talk about some of the foods of the time, particularly the German influenced foods. We certainly, again, thinking back to Weaver's book about the shoe fly pie book, which really talks about sort of the fake lore, he calls it, of Pennsylvania Dutch foods. This was really the more authentic, really what they were making at the time. And this is not Amish or Mennonite, but it is Pennsylvania German. One of Kookler's signature dishes was Hassenpfeffer, which is a sweet and sour rabbit stew, If you're familiar with Laverne and Shirley, at the beginning they say Shmiel, Shemazel, Hassenpfeffer Incorporated. I have no idea what that means, but it always makes me think of, whenever I think of Hassenpfeffer, I think of that. But like I found some old recipes of it, and it would potentially include like soaking the rabbit in vinegar for days. And so I can sort of see why people might not want to have it as much as they used to. Of course, rabbit is not as easy to come by these days either, but it is an interesting dish for sure. Also, I mentioned earlier, chicken and waffles was a huge thing, and we're talking about Burke style chicken and waffles. So typically chicken stewed in gravy over waffles, not the soul food that is so popular these days. Sometimes roast chicken over waffles. It's interesting because as I looked back on menus of the time, it seemed like waffles were served almost how we would serve rolls or, you know, Italian or French bread. Or it was just an accompaniment to the meal. So that's pretty interesting as well. A different hotel's chicken and waffle dinner was described as a culinary poem with many accompaniments in blank verse, which I thought sounded pretty good to me.
And I think the waffles actually were much thinner than we think of as our waffles. We could think of more like a pizzelle.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly not a Belgian style waffle, but maybe, you know, I mean, this is a bad reference because we're talking about Pennsylvania, but like more like a Waffle House style waffle. If you've ever had a waffle from the Waffle House, they're a lot thinner. And in the picture here is a relatively thin waffle. Kooklers piece de resistance was a pig roast, once described as, it is a whole pig of tender age and well-rounded proportions, brought entire and steaming with savory fume from stove to table. It is served on slices cut straight and around with dripping zestiness and eaten from large plates. On screen here, I've got a menu from a banquet that was hosted at Kooklers Roost. And of course, you can tell it's in Pennsylvania Dutch, but I'll read it to you in English because it's both interesting and also shows some of Kooklers' wit. So it reads as follows. The first round, noodle soup, celery, tomato salad, a little wine. Second round, suckling pig filled with chestnuts. And then there's an asterisk and it says, chestnuts if Kookler can buy them. If not, then perhaps bread or potato stuffing. Not quite, but almost as good. Applesauce, other things, a little more wine. Third round, sauerkraut, Berks County style, mashed potatoes, and still more wine. Fourth round, steamed rooster with wine broth, and still celery, potato salad, red beets, baked potatoes, to health. Fifth round, cake with gravy, grapes, still more wine, but a little more saving. Sixth and best round, coffee, Alsace wine. Alsace is not Alsace, France, but Alsace Township in Berks County. Kronthal spring water, Roost champagne, Roost punch, as we like it. I think these people had a bit of fun at this banquet. I'm going to go out on a limb and say. All right. So the interesting thing to me is we can guess how the food tasted. Like, it's a whole roast pig. I'm sure it was amazing, but you know, we've had whole roast pig and it's delicious for sure. But how did the wine taste? We're talking about these different grapes, maybe different methods of making wine. It's been a real challenge for me, you know, and one of the things I've tried to figure out, we can't, even if we still had wine from this time, which we don't, it would be vinegar by now, right? And unfortunately, there was no Wine Spectator or Food and Wine magazine or anything like that around, and we don't have detailed tasting notes. I was talking about tar and the weird things that wine people like myself sometimes write about, you know, cigar box and all the random things that we say. But at least in the future, if someone reads it, they'll go, oh, okay, I get a sense of what that means. A lot of what I found talked about how good the wine was. Like, it has a superior flavor, but that doesn't really tell you anything, does it? One thing I found on Clinton, this wasn't about a local Clinton, but it was, you know, somewhere in the Northeast. It makes a good dark and heavy wine with a most delightful wintergreen flavor if used in a well-ripened state. Wintergreen is not a thing I would necessarily associate with wine, but maybe an herbal minty thing you could find. Catawba has been described as juice, which is definitely foxy after the nature of its Labrusca parent, but which may be transformed into a still wine that is dry to the point of austerity and has a very clean flavor and a curious, special, spicy aroma, whatever that means. Dry to the point of austerity is an interesting comment. The native grapes tend to have higher acidity than the European grapes, so that was something when you were making the wine you had to think about. At the same time, I found people talking about it not being so great. And, having been able to taste some wines, and we'll get to them in a minute, there's a reason why we now grow European grapes here in Pennsylvania and all across the United States, because they make higher quality wines. There was a couple comments that I found in writings of the time. The very best of it was miserable stuff. The beloved Catawba champagne, this is talking about Longworth in Ohio, tastes to our uninitiated palates little better than cider. So there certainly were their critics, although certainly looking through the papers of the time in Pennsylvania, it borders on propaganda for talking about how great the wines were. And it may, again, you drank what you could, you had fun, it was palatable, you had good food, good wine, good company, and tried to use it to enjoy life in a very European style. The other thing that's really interesting, I remember when I first presented this topic at the Berks History Center, a guy came up to me after and said, they were all sweet wines, right? And I said, yeah, I'm not so sure about that. There certainly were sweet wines, and Americans are certainly known for having a palate towards sweeter things than the Europeans were. But there's also plenty of evidence that dry wines were made. As you can see from this ad that I pulled out, dry Catawba wine, sweet Catawba wine, Clinton wines, not labeled, of course. Around this time, in Germany in particular, a process called chaptalization was developing a following, which essentially is adding sugar to the wine. So you're adding dry sugar to the wine must. But it's not to make the wine sweet, it's to actually increase the alcohol. So you're adding sugar, and the yeast is then converting sugar, whether the sugar is in the grapes or the sugar is added, the yeast is going to convert the sugar to alcohol. So just because sugar is added during the winemaking process does not mean that the end wine ends up being sweet. There was another really interesting article I found of a Pennsylvania farmer, winemaker from the late 1800s, where he actually made 3 grades of wine. So the first grade was kind of what we call today the free run juice. So if you crush the juice and it kind of just oozes out, that's the highest quality juice. And then a second crush, and those could be made, those have enough sugar and so forth to be made into a regular wine as we would today, let it ferment and bottle it. And then your sort of lowest grade wine was taking sort of the leftover must and pomace of the crushed grapes, and then you would add sugar and water to it and make a lesser quality wine out of that. In the end, I believe that we had sweet wines, there were dry wines, there were fortified wines, there were off dry wines, kind of just like we have today. So one of the wines that we talked about, or one of the wines that we had suggested that you try if you're interested in trying is this what's called Allegro Punk. Okay, this is a rosé wine made from the Catawba grape.
I'm showing it now on my screen. I can see it.
It is pink. So as I said, Catawba is a red grape. But remember, we talked about that foxiness is actually, a lot of that comes from the skins. And so a lot of times Catawba is made into a pink or even a white wine, and that's by limiting contact with the skins, because the color in wine in most cases comes from the skins. Usually the juice itself is clear. This is a relatively sweet wine. Obviously, if you're tasting it, it's pretty common to to make these hybrid grapes sweet today, because the sweetness does kind of offset that foxy funkiness that we talked about. Again, there are probably some made this sweet, others maybe not made quite as sweet. The other thing,
there should be some foxiness in here.
yeah, I mean, there's a little bit, I find on the nose, if you smell it, you can find just a little bit of just like a kind of a funky,
Yeah, I can see that.
Funky odor. Almost like an underripeness, even though it might not be underripe. That's
I haven't been around a wet fox before, so I don't know what that smells like. But
think about like a wet dog, although wet dog is usually what corked wine smells like. So
I don't know if anybody else has this wine, is tasting it. It's obviously very sweet.
The other thing is that it's just really grapey. And I mean, that may be because we associate grapey with Concord grapes and Welch's grape juice. But it really does have that kind of aroma and flavor as well.
There were some Pennsylvania wines I saw in the store, in the state store, that were Concord grape wine.
Yeah, no, they definitely make Concord wines as well. I mean, I've never had one that's been particularly good, but you know, if for people that like sweet wines, it's certainly an option. This wine comes from a winery called Allegro Vineyard out in New York. And Brogue, PA, I believe, is the town that they're in. Although I think they have a few locations now. They've been around since the early '70s, actually, and they make a pretty large portfolio of wines, a fair amount of sweet wines. They make an Isabella wine as well, which we talked about. I was thinking of suggesting that, but it looks like they sold out over the summer. But I thought that was kind of interesting. But then they also make a fair amount with European varieties. The Cadenza Vineyard is kind of their vineyard for high quality wines. And I know the winemaker there really believes in sort of the dry, high quality winemaking, but also makes the sweet wines too. There's a joke in Pennsylvania that sweet wines they call them chateau cash flow, because the sweet wines are kind of what pay the bills and allow them to try to make dry wines as well. That's changing as the industry improves, but sweet wines are still kind of a bigger seller in terms of local wine. It's interesting though, as we talked about, the wines weren't always sweet, even with these hybrids. And I like to take a step back and think about like what happened. How do we get to where we were today? And essentially what happened is Prohibition came along and shut down all these wineries. And especially, in places like Berks County, if you're a farmer and you're making grapes and either making wine and selling it or selling the grapes to someone else to make wine, no one was stopping you from continuing to grow grapes. But if you couldn't sell them for a lot of, for enough money anymore, then you would rip them out and plant them with something else. I'm sure people still grew grapes for their own, wine consumption, but as an industry, it really fell out. And then I don't know how much you guys know about the origins of the Pennsylvania Liquor Control Board, but really post-Prohibition, it was established very overtly as something that made it as hard as possible for people to get alcohol. And they were no friend to local wineries. There were some wine companies that reopened. This ad that's on the screen is actually a place Reinigers that was in Berks, established 1863. They did reopen after Prohibition, but they just bought wines from New York State and made them into wine. There was really nobody making estate wines really until the late 60s, when finally the PA Wine Limited Winery Act was passed and allowed actual wineries to come back into play in the state. So if it took California 50 years to recover from Prohibition, it's really taken Pennsylvania 100 years to recover, because we lost 50 years of experimentation and learning. So then the second wine that I had recommended was Quaff from Pinnacle Ridge. And this is a wine that's made from Chambourcin, which is another hybrid grape was developed more recently, was not around during the times we were talking about earlier, but is probably the most popular hybrid grape in Pennsylvania today. And there's also a little bit of Pinot Noir in this wine. The reason I suggested trying this wine is that it has a little bit of that hybrid funkiness that we talked about to it for sure.
Very funky.
But it's also slightly sweet. It's not too sweet. It's only slightly sweet. And I think that that's kind of a style that you saw a lot of back in the times we were talking about, where there was a little bit of sweetness, certainly sweeter than, a Chianti or something like that, or a Burgundy, but not full-on sweet wine. A wine that you could certainly drink with savory food. And they actually call this the pizza wine. I'm not sure that I agree with that, but
I'm not sure either.
It's not bad.
It does have a very funky smell, though.
Yeah, it's pretty funky. I mean, there's a little bit of bottle variation as well. I've had bottles that are really funky and bottles that aren't funky at all. But for I think it's $12 or $13, maybe not even. It's not a bad wine. And if you're a sweet wine lover and want to transition over to dry wines, it's a nice blend between the two. This comes from Pinnacle Ridge Winery, which is in the Kutztown area.
Where does that name come from?
Pinnacle Ridge?
No, Quaff. Yeah.
Quaff, it just means like quaff, like I can just throw it back really easily. Yeah. Pinnacle Ridge actually developing a reputation for their high quality sparkling wine program. So.
Oh wow.
If you're looking for something to celebrate.
My state store had a good number of Pinnacle Ridge wines there.
Yeah, they're probably the biggest winery in Berks. At least that's making high quality wine. So I wanted to talk a little more broadly about before we wrap up. I just want to talk a little bit more broadly about Pennsylvania wine, because we've talked about it a little bit here. Mark, I think you said you're from Chadds Ford. There's some interesting wineries in Chadds Ford. I really feel like I've been following Pennsylvania wine for a while now. I actually started a website called Pennsylvania Vine Company, which was named after Pierre Legaux's company. And we're focused, the website is focused on highlighting high quality wineries that are making high quality dry wine in Pennsylvania. And I really feel like in the last 5 to 10 years, maybe, I've seen a real increase in quality, especially with these cooler climate European grapes. German, Austrian grapes, people are starting to use, and those tend to work really well. Gruner Veltliner, which is the third wine that I'd recommend trying, from a place called Galen Glen, who's actually has the second oldest planting of Gruner, as we call it, in the United States. Dan, I know you have Stony Run, which is a Berks County winery, and that they make a really nice Gruner as well. In fact, Gruner, it's probably the grape that I'm most excited about in Pennsylvania. Every time I try a new one, it seems to be good. This is a grape that's popular in Austria.
They characterize it as this: a bit of buttered waffles topped with fresh whipped cream greets the nose.
I don't know that I would agree with that. It tends to, I find that it tends to be more like herbal, and it's very acidic and very dry, but really good with food. You get maybe some apple or stone fruit kind of notes on there as well.
Yes, and then it goes on: tangerine and white pepper with hints of gooseberry and toasted almonds play on the palate.
There you go. White pepper actually is kind of the signature of Gruner. If you're one of these people who's into blind tasting wine, white pepper is something that you always get out of Gruner Veltliner. Riesling, of course, another Germanic grape, does really well here. Galen Glen has a nice Riesling. A lot of people been doing Riesling for a while. On the red side, Cabernet Franc, which is a grape that tends to do well in cooler climates, is really nice here in Pennsylvania. Galen Glen has another wine that they call Three German Bastards. It's three sort of lesser known Germanic red grapes, again, that do well in cooler climates. They call them bastards because they're hard to grow, but they're fun to taste. But that's another good wine. But yeah, the industry is really coming around where you can see just the quality is there. It can be a little bit more expensive to purchase local wines. One of the things I like about Galen Glen is that their wines are not super expensive. Certainly, sometimes you're talking $35, $40 for a bottle of local wine, and you think I could, get a great wine from California or Europe for that same price. So that is a little bit of a challenge, but for a variety of factors, it's expensive to make wine here. I'm just looking. They just released this week the PA sommelier judgment. So they have a bunch of sommeliers from Philly do a blind tasting of a bunch of PA wines, and they just released their 2020 winners. Galen Glen's on there a bunch of times. Penn's Woods is in Chadsford. Stony Run has a few on there as well.
And if people are interested in visiting any of these wineries, would you recommend sort of the winery experience if there's any ones that are more interesting than others?
Sure. I'm going to share this this PA judgment thing in the chat too. So my favorite winery to visit is a place called Vala in Chester County in Avondale. They make it's an Italian-American family, and they do a lot of Italian grapes like Barbera and Nebbiolo and things like that. But it's just it's a small, tiny little place. They only sell their wine at the door, and it's very rare to find it anywhere else. They have a great tasting where like they pair local cheeses and chocolates with their wine, which is really cool. I don't know I think that they had some outdoor events during COVID. I'm not sure exactly. I know Penn's Woods does a lot of interesting events down in Chadsford, and they've been doing quite a bit over the summer. I haven't been to Galen Glen, even though I said I like their wines a lot. But yeah, I think a lot of places are starting to open. And if you go on the PennsylvaniaWine.com, there's a link that shows you like what people are doing during COVID times in terms of visiting and stuff. It's a shame we couldn't go on a visit ourselves, but maybe that's a future event for you.
Yeah, exactly.
All righty. So that's everything I wanted to cover. If there are any questions, again, my book is Lost Mount Penn. It does go into a little bit of the Pennsylvania history that we talked about at the beginning, and then digs a little bit deeper into Reading. I've got it on sale for $20 through my website. You can buy it on Amazon for even cheaper than that. I would certainly appreciate it if you bought it through me, but I'll be happy if you buy it either way. It's also $10 on Kindle, I think so. And then you can follow me on all the socials at Life at Table is my hook.
Well, Mike, thank you very, very much. It was a fascinating talk. I think people didn't realize how much wine history we have here in Pennsylvania, and it's great to learn that. And I really appreciate the talk. I don't see any more questions in the chat. If you do, please let us know if you do have any other questions. I did record this, and so it will be available on our website. And I am excited about tasting these wines. And today is the most perfect day for a celebration.
Yes.
And there's nothing more fantastic to celebrate Pennsylvania's history today of all days than drinking some Pennsylvania wine. So cheers to all of you. Cheers to you, Mike.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Safe travels to everybody, and we'll see you next time on Historic Foodways program. Bye, guys.